Hello, I'm Edward Allport, and this is a series about reading poetry. And this is the second part, so it's not quite a series yet, but it's getting there. And in the first session, I talked about how poetry needs a special way of reading that's not the same as reading prose, articles, and books and things. Poetry is written to carry much deeper layers of meaning than prose, and we need to be prepared to dig a bit deeper to uncover those layers. And in this session, we'll be exploring the ways in which we respond to poetry and absorb it. Last time, I also talked about how our own reactions and receptions to poetry is all very individual and subjective. So I'm not going to tell you how to read it. I'm going to give you some suggestions and some pointers as to how I read it and perhaps how other people read it, and hope that this will be helpful for you in finding your own ways. And I talked about poems having layers to be uncovered, and I'd like you to explore how you read poems that are known to have layers that can be excavated. And it may require a little bit of self-analysis and observation, but it shouldn't be more than you're comfortable with. The objective is to help you find out how you read and relate to established example. What hooks you in? What keeps you engaged? What are you going to take from it, so that you can apply that knowledge to other poems as you read them? And it's going to involve some homework. But hey, I'm a teacher. Of course, you're going to get homework. Now, what I'd like you to do is choose some poems that you know you like and you relate to. Choose two or three at least and vary the choice as much as possible. And it doesn't matter if they're really well known, they're your choice, and you just need to know that you like them. And you need to be honest in acknowledging your own responses. So here are some examples that you could start with. Remember, these are my choices. And what I started off with was Daffodils by Wordsworth. I wandered lonely as a cloud. And although this is a recording, I can hear you say, daffodils, but that's such a cliche, which is fair, which is true. But it's also a wonderful poem. In fact, it's a cliche because it's a wonderful poem. It's so wonderful that it's become overused and overexposed, but that does not stop it being wonderful. I also chose Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost, On the Beach at Night Alone by Walt Whitman, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night by Dylan Thomas, William Blake's The Sick Rose, Hawk Roosting by Ted Hughes, and The Lake Isle of Innisfree by Yeats. And this is a very short analysis of some of my response to these poems to give you an idea of what I'm looking for from you. And remember, I'm not analysing the poem. That's for other people. I'm just looking at my responses. And I'm not going to read them to you because hearing someone else reading will colour your response. I've put them up here, but you can find them at thepoetryfoundation.org. You're probably familiar with them anyway. So let's start with Daffodils. It starts with a picture and it draws me in. These days, if we see a wodge of daffs, it's likely to be a municipal planting scheme, but seeing them in the wild is an amazing sight. A burst of gold on green, and Wordsworth takes me there. I'm walking with him in spirit, because otherwise he wouldn't be alone. I'm walking with him, and there's a spectacular swathe of daffodils, and he uses dancing words, fluttering, twinkling, sprightly, and it's full of wonder, very immediate and sensual. And I'm feeling the daffodils. I'm feeling his pleasure in them. And I have difficulty with the third stanza because he uses a stupid word, jocund, so I tend to slide over it, but it's not important. The first two stanzas have caught me. But then it changes. And a lot of poems have a turning point that teachers would call a volta. And in this case, it's just before the fourth stanza. And he doesn't lose me. He catches the moment, that moment after you've had a wonderful experience, when you look back and you relive it. And it's great. And the memory is as wonderful as the experience itself. And the first three, or two depending, capture the experience, but the last captures the recollection and rounds it off. Even with that third stanza, it's pretty perfect. Now, Stopping by Woods is another weirdly perfect poem. It's so short and so ordinary, and it describes just a small pause in a journey. And you can talk about the structure and you can talk about the rhyme scheme, but how can you explain how it may be the greatest poem that has come out of the USA? And it's so small. It's just four stanzas and it's very simple. But ever since I first read it, and I didn't know then that it was famous, I had the feeling that underneath the simplicity, there's something massive going on, a huge feeling of regret, perseverance, stoicism. It's the repeated last line of Miles to Go. The two lines have the same words, but the second has a completely different feel to the first. But like Wordsworth, Frost draws me in. He's speaking to me. I'm sitting on the box with him, and the little detail of the horse shaking his harness bells, the loneliness, and that last line is a sigh, and you can almost hear the flick of the rain as he tells the horse to walk on. But let me tell you a little story. Two little stories, really, but they're related. The first I've known a long time, which is how Stopping by Woods was written, and it was recounted by Frost himself. He was an established poet, and he was working on his masterpiece, a long poem called New Hampshire. And he'd be working on it all night, and he'd fallen asleep, or he'd finished it, put down the pen or whatever, looked out of the window, and it was snowing. And he got up, looked out of the window again, and this poem popped into his head. And he wrote it down, just as he thought of it, and he put in a placeholder for the last two lines because he couldn't think of how to end it. But when he came back to it, he realized that what he got down on the bit of paper was completely perfect, and he hardly had to edit it at all. And the last two repeated lines were perfect as well. And he knew in that moment that it was this little tiny poem, this throwaway poem that he'd written on a scrap of paper, that was going to be his masterpiece. You can read New Hampshire, you can find it online. It's worthy, and it's long and complicated, but Stopping by Woods is a masterpiece. The second story is that when he was young, before he was an established poet, he was a farmer. He tried his hand at farming, and he wasn't very successful. And he recounted that one Christmas, just before Christmas, he'd gone off to market to sell, with a cart with a load of goods to sell, and hadn't sold anything. He had to come home with the stuff still in the cart and no money. And he caused a breakdown. He broke down on the journey. And although he never explicitly linked, well, don't know that he ever explicitly linked the two stories, you can feel it's that sort of emotional upheaval which is boiling underneath the surface of Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. What links these two poems and my response to them is the sense of being there, of what I've seen called the lived experience. They're very personal and on a small canvas, but they give me the opportunity to share the experience with the poet. In the next poem, On the Beach at Night Alone, there's the same sense of immediacy and intimacy at the start, which hooks me in, but it moves quickly onto a huge canvas, the nature and existence of the universe itself. Now, I live near the sea, and I've had the experience of being on the beach at night, although probably not alone, and hearing the sea muttering to itself and seeing the vast swathes of stars overhead, and the experience is overwhelming. But unlike the others, this is so-called free verse. Whitman was one of the pioneers of free verse, but that doesn't mean to say that it's unstructured. Whitman puts that personal experience into the opening, standing by the sea and looking at the stars, listening to the sea's husky voice, and then opens up into a sort of ritual, an incantation. It sounds almost like a triumphant declaration, a fanfare of words. And the rhythm builds up and carries me along until the triumphant end. And there are two voltas in this poem, which is a lot for such a short poem. And in each case, the key phrase is vast similitude. And similitude is an unusual word, but there's no word that I know of that has the same meaning and feeling. It's a vast word and it's a vast poem, despite being quite short. And I feel almost punch-drunk when I've been reading it. Blake's The Sick Rose goes in the opposite direction, and this is an occasion when the pleasure is seeing how the writer uses a technical trick to connect with the reader. And in this case, Blake uses the meter to manipulate the way that the reader has to approach it. He starts light. It's in triple time, to use a musical term, and a piece, to use a prosodic term, and it's a dancing rhythm through the first stanza, so it feels lively. Though he puts two beats on howl to make the howl really long. And then he shifts to two time, march time, iambic. And by the end of it, the last two lines have no meter at all. It's been destroyed like the rose. It's very short and it's quite simple, but its emotional punch is in the way the meter forces the reader to confront the destruction of the rose in the last lines. And my sympathy is entirely with the rose, which is just how Blake intended it. Now, I can't show you Hawk Roosting because it's still under copyright, but you can find it at the Poetry Foundation. And Hawk Roosting isn't a comic poem, but it always amuses me because it has this tone of disdain and complacency, coupled with the irony of knowing that the hawk is not in control. And it suggests Hughes's disdain for the aristocracy, or maybe mine, who knows? Now, Dylan Thomas's work came out of copyright at the end of 23, and Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night is about as good as it gets. It's a very technical poem. It's in a strict form, a villanelle, probably the best known villanelle in the English language. In fact, scrub that, it's definitely the best known villanelle in the English language. And it's a difficult form to write with all those careful repetitions. And Thomas is using them to convey intensity because this is an anguished poem. It's all twisted up on itself. It's about fighting against death and regret for death coming too soon until we get the focus of the last stanza. The death of his father, the impending death of his father. And suddenly it becomes clear what this is about. It's not general observations. It's very personal. But that only increases the anguish. Finally, The Lake Isle of Innisfree has all the nostalgia and yearning for the simple life that Yeats describes, but that's pretty much on the surface. Remember, this is a lake isle, and lake isles are often associated with the other world. So Yeats's yearning has a spiritual dimension as well as a natural one. And I can usually relate to poems that evoke folklore, especially if they put the lore into a contemporary context. So, summarizing my responses, the aspects of the poems that draw me in are, in the first place, the sense of shared experience, the lived experience, as I mentioned above. I like to feel involved with and identify with the poet's point of view. And the use of simple language, the way Wordsworth introduces Jocund to daffodils, is a complete turn-off for me. If you use an unusual word, it has to have a purpose, and the word should not be replaceable. In this case, Jocund could easily be replaced by joyful, whereas similitude would be difficult to replace. And the mood that it expresses, and often there's more than one, but the progress from mood to mood has to feel natural. And that's the organization of the logical sequence in the poems. Because once I've been hooked, I like to stay hooked, and I don't want to readjust halfway through. Even Whitman's poem, though it's free verse, has an emotional logic to it. I like poems that are emotionally or verbally coherent. And if they're too scattergun, I find them a bit of a challenge. And I'm a sucker for folklore-based poems. So what I hope I've given you here is an indication about the sort of responses that I feel to these poems, to give you an idea about what you should be looking for in your responses to your choice of poems. You don't need to define in words how you respond, but you should be aware of your responses so that you can try them out on other poems. And as you read more, you'll be able to come to identify a much wider range of responses, and that should only deepen your experience further. Now, in the next session, we'll be looking at ways of approaching a poem and preparing yourself to give yourself the best chance of feeling a response. And I'll see you then.